Hey, I'm John. Welcome back to my shop. The next step in the Keepsake box is to cut the half-blind dovetails. Stick around and I'll show you how I do it. The first step in this process is to decide how big of a lap I want on the pin board. Proportions are important when it comes to dovetails, particularly half-blind dovetails. I usually start with a lap that's a quarter the thickness of the pin board. I then scribe that line on the pin board and then all the way around the tail boards. Once I've scribed that line all the way around both ends of both tail boards, I use a wheel marking gauge to get the thickness of the tail boards. I set the fence of the marking gauge on one board and drop the cutter head down to the other to get a nice accurate measurement. I then use that measurement to scribe a baseline on the pin board. I begin laying out the dovetail spacing with the half pins on the sides of the tail board. These need to be big enough that they provide the support necessary to avoid splitting the pins as you assemble the joint, but not so big that they look clunky. Next, I use a pair of dividers to lay out the spacing for the tails. In this case, I'm going to have 3 tails. As I walk the dividers across the board, I start with one point in the impression I made for one of the half pins. Whatever distance I end up beyond the other impression will determine the size of each pin. Once I get the spacing right, I go back and leave deeper impressions with the dividers, walking them in from each half pin mark. I use a dovetail marker to square a line across the end of the tail board. Before marking the line across the board, you'll notice that I drop a sharp pencil point into the impression left by the dividers. I'll then slide the dovetail marking gauge over to the pencil point. This allows me to get a really accurate mark right on that impression that was left by the dividers. I then repeat the same process on the face, marking out the 1 in 8 angle that I like to use for hardwoods. I want these dovetails to be evenly spaced all the way around the box, so I mark the spacing from one tail board onto all the other ends of the tail boards. Next, I begin cutting out the dovetails. With half-blind dovetails, it's not as critical that this cut be completely square across the board, because it ends up being covered by the lap on the pin board. But it's always good to practice accurate sawing and will make for a better joint. I try to stop the cut just above the baseline and then repeat the process for all of the dovetails before moving on to the next step. Once I've got all the tails cut, I use a coping saw to cut close to the baseline and remove most of the waste. I'll be using a chisel to clean up the baseline, so this cut doesn't have to be super accurate, but the closer you get it, the less likely you'll have tear out on the end grain. I use a chisel to create a small notch where I can drop my dovetail saw to cut the shoulders on these tail boards. I'll be using a chisel again to clean up this cut, but it's very important that I stay on the waist side of the line. If you go below the shoulder line, it will show up as a gap in the finished piece. I use a small chisel to clean out the space between the tails. I haven't left a lot of waste here to clean up, but you'll notice that I'm taking very small cuts. If you try to chop too much out at once, the wedging action of the bevel can crush the shoulder line, which will show as a gap in the finished product. I can use a wider chisel to clean up the shoulders. I take really shallow cuts again to get a nice smooth finish, and then eventually place the tip of the chisel right in the gauge line to finish the cut. I then repeat the process for all of the dovetails. I use the blade of my square to make sure there's no bumps between the tails that would prevent the joint from seating fully. Because these joints will be individually fitted, I take the time to mark each piece so that I can put them back together in the proper order. The next step is to trace the tails onto the pin board. The layout is critical if you want a tight fitting joint, so it's important to take your time and make sure that you get it right. In this case, the pin board is actually quite a bit taller than the tail board, so it's important that I make sure and reference from the bottom as I line these up. I then use a knife to carefully trace around each tail onto the pin board. I use a sharp pencil and a square to mark a plumb line down the face of the board, and then mark out the waist. I use a dovetail saw to make a relief cut in the pin board, staying just away from the line. There are a lot of ways to cut half-blind dovetails, but for this box I decided to use a chisel to chop out the waist. This can take a little longer than some other methods, but leaves a nice clean socket. Next, I stand the board up in the vise and begin the process of cleaning up the cuts. It's nice to have a variety of chisels in order to get down into the corners. I especially like this 1/8" chisel that helps me get deep into the corners. I take my time making small cuts and slowly work my way back to the lines. I cut a small chamfer on the inside corner of each dovetail. This will help it to seat a little bit easier as it goes into the pin board. Watching the joints come together is my favorite part of any project, and this one came out looking great. If you like what you saw in this video, please give it a thumbs up and leave a comment down below. And if you want to be notified every time I post a new video, make sure you subscribe to my channel and ring the notification bell. Thanks for watching.